Bear cub becomes baby's taste tester. They share every meal safely. The morning mist hung low over the pine trees, creating a soft white blanket that seemed to muffle every sound in the forest. Ethan Marshall stood at the kitchen window of their small cabin, watching the sun slowly pierce through the fog, turning everything it touched into gold. His coffee cup steamed in his hands, the warmth spreading through his fingers as he heard the familiar sounds of his wife, Jessica, preparing breakfast behind him. But there was something different about this morning, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up, not from fear, but from a strange sense of anticipation he couldn't quite explain. The forest seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something, and as he watched, he noticed movement at the edge of the clearing where their property met the wild woods. Jessica was humming softly as she mashed bananas for their 8-month-old daughter Lily, who sat in her high chair, babbling happily and banging a wooden spoon against the tray. The sound echoed through the cabin, a rhythmic tapping that seemed to call out into the morning stillness. Ethan was about to turn away from the window when he saw it again, that movement in the shadows between the trees. He leaned closer to the glass, his breath fogging it slightly, and that's when he saw the small brown shape emerge from the forest edge. It was a bear cub, no bigger than a medium-sized dog, with fur that caught the morning light and eyes that seemed far too intelligent for such a young creature. The cub moved slowly, cautiously, but not with the typical wariness of a wild animal. Instead, it moved with what looked like purpose, as if it had somewhere specific to be. "Jessica," Ethan called softly, not wanting to startle either his family or the unexpected visitor. "Come look at this, but move slowly." Jessica picked up Lily from her high chair, the baby's breakfast temporarily forgotten, and joined her husband at the window. The three of them watched as the bear cub approached their cabin, stopping about 20 feet from the back porch. It sat down in the grass, its head tilted slightly to one side, and seemed to be looking directly at their window, or, more specifically, at baby Lily in Jessica's arms. The cub's expression was almost expectant, as if it was waiting for something, and when Lily let out a delighted squeal and waved her chubby arms, the cub's ears perked up, and it made a soft huffing sound that almost seemed like acknowledgement. They stood there frozen for several minutes, unsure of what to do. Living in the mountains meant wildlife encounters were common, but this felt different. The cub showed no signs of aggression or fear. It simply sat there, watching them with those dark, intelligent eyes. Jessica shifted Lily to her other hip, and the movement seemed to break the spell. The cub stood up, gave what looked like a small nod, and then turned and walked back into the forest, disappearing as quietly as it had appeared. Ethan and Jessica looked at each other, both wondering if they had imagined the whole thing, but the small paw prints in the dewy grass proved it had been real. The next morning arrived with the same misty quietness, and Ethan found himself at the window again, coffee in hand, watching for any sign of their visitor. Jessica had just settled Lily into her high chair for breakfast when they heard it, a soft scratching at the back door. Not the aggressive scratching of an animal trying to get in, but more like a gentle knock, as if someone was politely requesting entry. Ethan moved to the door cautiously, peering through the small window, and there was the cub again, sitting on the porch steps, looking up at the door with that same patient expression. This time, the cub had something in its mouth, a small cluster of wild berries, the kind that grew deeper in the forest where humans rarely ventured. Without really thinking about it, Ethan slowly opened the door just a crack. The cub didn't move, didn't try to push its way in. It simply placed the berries gently on the porch and then backed away a few steps, sitting down again to watch. Jessica had joined him at the door, Lily in her arms, and when the baby saw the cub, she let out another happy sound and reached out her tiny hands. The cub's eyes seemed to soften at the sight of the baby, and it made that same soft huffing sound they had heard the day before. Jessica, moved by some instinct she couldn't name, took a small piece of the mashed banana she had been feeding Lily and placed it on a plate. She handed it to Ethan, who, feeling slightly ridiculous but strangely compelled, set the plate on the porch next to the berries. The cub approached slowly, sniffed the banana, and then did something that made both parents gasp. It took a tiny taste, just the smallest lick, and then sat back and watched them as if waiting. After a moment, when nothing happened, the cub pushed the plate back toward them with its nose, then retreated to its previous spot. It was such a deliberate, intelligent action that Ethan and Jessica could only stare. The message seemed clear, though impossible. The cub had tested the food, deemed it safe, and returned it. But that was crazy, wasn't it? Bears didn't behave like that. Yet here was this small creature, acting more like a concerned guardian than a wild animal. Over the following days, the morning visits became a routine. The cub would appear just as Lily was having her breakfast, always bringing some small offering from the forest, berries, pine cones, once even a particularly smooth river stone. Each time, it would wait patiently while Jessica prepared Lily's food, and each time when offered a small portion, it would taste it first before pushing it back. The ritual was so consistent, so deliberate, that Ethan and Jessica began to accept it as just another part of their morning routine. They never fed the cub directly, understanding instinctively that this wasn't about the bear needing food. This was about something else entirely. Something they couldn't quite understand but felt in their hearts was important. Jessica started documenting these encounters in a journal, noting the time of each visit, what the cub brought, how it behaved. She noticed patterns that seemed impossible for a wild animal. The cub never came when Lily was sleeping, never appeared during dinner or lunch, only breakfast. It seemed to know somehow when the baby would be awake and ready to eat. Even stranger, on mornings when Lily was fussy or unwell, the cub would arrive earlier and stay longer, making soft, almost purring sounds that seemed to calm the baby. Jessica wrote about how Lily would stop crying the moment she saw her unusual friend, how her whole face would light up with joy that seemed to be reciprocated in the cub's gentle eyes. Ethan, ever the practical one, had initially wanted to call wildlife services, worried about the safety implications of a wild bear, even a small one, coming so close to their home. But something stopped him every time he reached for the phone. Maybe it was the way the cub never came closer than invited, never showed any sign of aggression or unpredictability. Or maybe it was the way Lily seemed to communicate with it on some level neither parent could understand, exchanging looks and sounds that appeared to be a conversation of sorts. Whatever it was, Ethan found himself becoming as attached to their morning visitor as his wife and daughter were. The town was small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, so it wasn't long before word got out about the marshal's unusual breakfast guest. Some neighbors were concerned, warning them about the dangers of habituating wild animals. Others were simply curious, wanting to see this remarkable behavior for themselves. But Ethan and Jessica were protective of their morning ritual, politely declining offers to come watch or suggestions to film it for social media. This felt private, sacred somehow, like they had been chosen to witness something special that wasn't meant for the wider world. One particularly memorable morning, about 3 weeks after the visits began, the cub arrived with something different. Instead of berries or forest treasures, it carried a small worn piece of fabric in its mouth. It was faded and weathered, but Jessica could make out that it had once been part of a baby's blanket, the kind with satin edges that children often became attached to. The cub placed it carefully on the porch and then, for the first time, came closer to the door where Lily sat in her high chair just inside. The baby reached out through the doorway, and for one heart-stopping moment, her tiny fingers brushed the cub's nose. The cub closed its eyes and made a sound that was unmistakably contentment, then backed away to its usual spot. Jessica picked up the piece of blanket, turning it over in her hands. It was old, very old, and had clearly been outside for a long time. But it had been preserved somehow, kept safe from complete deterioration. She showed it to Ethan later, after the cub had gone, and they puzzled over it together. Where had it come from? Why had the cub brought it? Was it possible that this small piece of fabric held some significance they couldn't understand? They placed it in a box with the other gifts the cub had brought, treating each item as the treasure it seemed to be in the cub's eyes. As the weeks turned into a month, the morning visits evolved into something even more extraordinary. The cub began to stay longer, sometimes settling down on the porch while Lily finished her breakfast. Jessica would often sit by the open door, Lily on her lap, and tell stories or sing songs. The cub would listen with what appeared to be rapt attention, its eyes half closed in contentment. Sometimes it would make soft sounds in response, not quite growls, more like hums of appreciation. Lily would babble back, and the two would engage in what looked for all the world like a conversation, though neither parent could understand the language being spoken. The trust between them grew slowly but steadily. The cub began to show them things, leading them with looks and small movements to show them where the best berry bushes were, where a family of rabbits had made their home, where an eagle nested high in a pine tree. It never strayed far from the cabin during these little expeditions, always keeping Lily in sight, always alert to any potential danger. Once, when a larger bear, possibly the cub's mother, appeared at the forest edge, the cub positioned itself between the cabin and the larger bear, making soft sounds until the adult bear turned and left. It was protective behavior that shouldn't have existed between a wild animal and humans, yet there it was, undeniable and deeply moving. Ethan found himself changing his entire morning routine around these visits. He would wake up earlier to make sure everything was ready, the porch swept clean, fresh water in a bowl they had started leaving out, though the cub rarely drank from it. He began researching bear behavior, trying to understand what they were witnessing, but nothing in any book or online resource explained what was happening at their cabin. Bears were intelligent, yes, but this level of deliberate, consistent, seemingly emotional behavior was unprecedented. Yet he couldn't deny what he was seeing with his own eyes, the careful way the cub would test each new food, the gentle interactions with Lily, the obvious affection in its eyes. One morning, the cub arrived limping slightly, a small cut visible on its front paw. Jessica's maternal instincts kicked in immediately, and before Ethan could stop her, she had grabbed the first aid kit and was approaching the injured animal. The cub sat perfectly still as she cleaned the wound with gentle hands, never flinching, never showing any sign of fear or aggression. It watched her face intently as she worked, and when she was done it touched its nose to her hand in what could only be described as a gesture of gratitude. From that day forward, the cub seemed to include Jessica in its protective watch, often bringing her specific gifts, flowers, or particularly pretty stones that seemed chosen just for her. The bond between Lily and the cub continued to deepen in ways that defied explanation. They had developed a morning greeting ritual where Lily would wave from her high chair, and the cub would stand up on its hind legs and paw the air gently in response. When Lily laughed, the cub would make a huffing sound that seemed like its version of laughter. When Lily cried, which was rare during their morning visits, the cub would pace anxiously, making worried sounds until the baby was comforted. It was like watching two old friends who had known each other far longer than the few weeks they had actually been acquainted. Jessica began to notice that Lily's development seemed to accelerate after the cub started visiting. She was more alert, more engaged with her surroundings, and seemed to understand things beyond what was typical for her age. She would look at the forest with knowing eyes, sometimes pointing at things her parents couldn't see, babbling excitedly as if sharing secrets with her unusual friend. The cub would often follow her gaze and make responding sounds, creating an entire dialogue that existed outside human understanding, but was clearly meaningful to both participants. The weather began to change as autumn approached, the mornings growing cooler, the mist thicker. The cub's fur was growing thicker too, preparing for the winter ahead, and Ethan and Jessica began to worry about what would happen when the snow came. Would their morning visitor hibernate? Would this strange, wonderful chapter of their lives come to an end? They tried not to think about it, focusing instead on treasuring each morning as it came, but the cub seemed to sense their concern, becoming more affectionate in its own way, staying longer, bringing more gifts, as if it too was trying to make the most of their time together. One particularly cold morning, the cub didn't come alone. Following behind it, moving with obvious caution, was an older bear. Not huge, but definitely adult, with graying fur around its muzzle, and eyes that held a weariness that spoke of many winters survived. The cub positioned itself between the older bear and the cabin, making soft, encouraging sounds, clearly trying to convey that this place, these people, were safe. The older bear sat down heavily at the forest edge, breathing labored, and Ethan could see that it was thin, too thin for a bear preparing for winter. The cub looked back at them, then at the older bear, then back again, its eyes pleading in a way that was unmistakably clear. Without hesitation, Jessica prepared a larger portion of the oatmeal she had been making for Lily, adding honey and nuts, foods that would provide the calories a bear needed. She set it in a bowl at the edge of the porch, then retreated inside with Ethan and Lily. The cub approached first, performed its usual testing ritual, then called to the older bear with soft sounds. Slowly, painfully, the older bear approached and began to eat, while the cub sat guard, watching both its elder and its human family with those intelligent, caring eyes. When the bowl was empty, the older bear looked directly at them through the window, and in its eyes they saw the same intelligence, the same unusual awareness that the cub possessed. The older bear began joining the morning visits, though it never came as close as the cub. It would wait at the tree line while the youngster performed their morning ritual with Lily, but its presence added a new dimension to the encounters. Sometimes Ethan would see the two bears communicating in ways that seemed almost like teaching moments, the older one guiding the younger in some incomprehensible lesson. Other times, the older bear would simply watch them all with those knowing eyes, as if it was remembering something or someone from long ago. As October arrived with its brilliant colors and crisp air, the morning visits took on a bittersweet quality. Everyone seemed to understand that change was coming, that this magical interlude couldn't last forever. The cub began bringing different gifts, things that could last, a particularly beautiful feather, a piece of quartz that caught the light, a perfectly preserved autumn leaf. Jessica kept each one carefully, creating a memory box that she would someday show Lily when she was old enough to understand how special this time had been. Though sometimes she wondered if Lily already understood in her own way, if perhaps she understood better than any of them. One morning, the cub arrived with something that made Jessica's heart skip. It was carrying a small wooden toy, carved in the shape of a bear, worn smooth by years of handling. It placed this treasure carefully on the porch, then sat back and waited. When Jessica picked it up, she could see initials carved into the bottom, though they were too worn to make out clearly. The cub watched her examine it, then did something extraordinary. It walked to a specific spot near the tree line and began pawing at the ground, looking back at them repeatedly until Ethan understood that it wanted them to follow. Ethan grabbed a small shovel from the garage while Jessica bundled Lily up against the cold. Together, they followed the cub to the spot it had indicated. The older bear watched from a distance but didn't interfere. The cub sat down next to a particularly large pine tree and continued pawing at a spot between two roots. Ethan began to dig carefully, not sure what he was looking for, but trusting that the cub had a reason for this request. About a foot down, his shovel hit something hard. Brushing away the dirt, he uncovered a small metal box, rusted but intact. The cub made a satisfied sound and stepped back, allowing them to retrieve it. Inside the cabin, with shaking hands, Jessica opened the box. Inside were photographs, old ones, dating back at least 50 years based on their style and condition. They showed a family, a young couple with a baby, standing in front of what was unmistakably their cabin, though it looked newer, less weathered. In several of the photos there was something else. A bear, not fully grown but not a cub either, sitting near the family as if it belonged there. On the back of one photo in fading ink, someone had written, "Tommy, Sarah, Baby Margaret, and Guardian 1971. The photographs told a story that seemed to echo their own. Image after image showed the bear, Guardian with the family. There was Guardian sitting next to the baby's high chair, Guardian playing in the yard with a toddler, Guardian watching protectively as the little girl took her first steps. The last photo in the box was different. It showed an older couple, the same man and woman but aged by perhaps 20 years, standing next to a grave marker. Even in the faded photograph, they could make out the shape of a bear carved into the stone. A handwritten note was tucked behind this photo, the ink faded but still legible. "To whoever finds this," the note read, "know that magic is real, and love transcends species. Guardian came to us when Margaret was born, stayed until she left for college, and returned to the forest to live out his days. We buried him beneath the old pine, where he loved to rest and watch over our family. If you're reading this, perhaps his spirit has found you too. Trust in the magic, protect the bond. Some things can't be explained, only felt in the heart." Tom and Sarah Mitchell, 1992. Jessica looked at Ethan with tears in her eyes, then out the window at the cub and the older bear. The cub was watching them through the glass, and when their eyes met, it nodded, actually nodded, as if confirming what they had just discovered. The older bear had moved closer during their absence, and now they could see it more clearly. Around its neck, so faded and worn they hadn't noticed it before, was an old collar, not a restraining collar but more like a necklace, with something hanging from it. The cub walked over to the older bear and gently touched the hanging object with its nose, then looked back at them. Understanding flooded through Jessica like a wave. This older bear had known the original Guardian, had perhaps been taught by him, shown that humans could be family, could be trusted, could be loved. And now it had brought its own cub to continue the tradition. To be Lily's guardian as the first bear had been Margaret's. The connection to this place, to this cabin, to the families who lived here, wasn't random or coincidental. It was intentional, passed down through generations of both humans and bears, a secret pact of protection and love that defied natural law, but existed nonetheless. The morning visits continued through October and into November, but they had changed now that everyone understood the true nature of their connection. The cub, who Jessica had started thinking of as Lily's guardian, became even more attentive, more protective. It would patrol the perimeter of the yard during their breakfast time, checking for any dangers, real or imagined. The older bear, who they had begun calling Elder, would sometimes share stories in its own way, using sounds and gestures to communicate things that seemed important for the cub to know. Ethan and Jessica would watch these lessons, understanding that they were witnessing the passing down of crucial knowledge, even if they couldn't comprehend the specifics. Lily seemed to bloom under this unusual attention. She was crawling now, always heading straight for the door when she heard the familiar scratch that announced Guardian's arrival. The cub would lie down on the porch, making itself as small and non-threatening as possible, and Lily would sit beside the screen door, patting the mesh gently while babbling her baby stories. Guardian would respond with soft huffs and rumbles, creating a dialogue that, while wordless to adult ears, was clearly meaningful to both participants. Sometimes Elder would join them, sitting a respectful distance away but watching with those ancient, knowing eyes that seemed to hold memories of similar scenes from decades past. The first snow came early that year, a light dusting that transformed the forest into a winter wonderland. Guardian arrived that morning with snowflakes still clinging to its fur, looking like it had been dusted with diamonds. Lily squealed with delight at the sight, and Guardian shook itself playfully, sending snow flying in all directions. It was the first truly playful behavior they had seen from the cub, as if the snow had awakened some young, joyful part of it that the responsibility of being a guardian usually kept hidden. Even Elder seemed affected by the snow, rolling in it briefly before remembering its dignity and sitting up with an almost embarrassed huff. As November progressed, the visits began to change in a way that made Ethan and Jessica's hearts heavy. Guardian and Elder would still come every morning, but they were eating more, preparing for something. Elder especially seemed to be conserving energy, moving more slowly, sleeping more often during the visits. They had read enough about bears to know what was coming. Hibernation, the long sleep that would separate them for months. But knowing it intellectually and facing it emotionally were two different things. How could they explain to Lily that her best friend would be going away? How could they themselves handle the absence of these creatures who had become such an integral part of their daily lives? One morning, Guardian arrived with something special, a branch from a pine tree, still green and fragrant despite the winter cold. It placed this on the porch with unusual ceremony, then went through an elaborate routine of touching various objects they had shared, the water bowl, the spot where Lily usually sat, the door frame where Jessica often stood. It was clearly saying goodbye, or at least see you later, in the only way it knew how. Elder watched this ritual with approval, occasionally adding its own touches, a gentle paw on the window where Ethan often stood, a soft huff toward Lily that sounded almost like a blessing. The next morning, they didn't come. Ethan stood at the window with his coffee, watching the tree line, but the forest remained still and quiet under its blanket of fresh snow. Lily fussed in her high chair, clearly expecting her friend, and Jessica had to fight back tears as she tried to distract her daughter with toys and songs. But as the days passed, they adjusted to the new quiet of their mornings, holding on to the faith that spring would bring their friends back to them. Jessica continued to document everything in her journal, adding the photographs they had found and the story of the first guardian, creating a record for Lily to read when she was older. Winter settled over the mountain like a heavy blanket, muffling sounds and turning their world into something out of a fairy tale. Ethan and Jessica would often find themselves at the window, watching for any sign of movement in the forest, but the bears were deep in their winter sleep, safe in whatever den they had prepared. Sometimes, though, they would find signs that they weren't forgotten, tracks in the snow that came close to the cabin but never quite reached it, as if Guardian or Elder had briefly woken and come to check on them before returning to sleep. These tracks always appeared after particularly stormy nights, as if the bears were making sure their human family had weathered the storm safely. Lily grew during those winter months, taking her first steps on Christmas morning, saying her first clear word on New Year's Eve. That word was bear, pronounced with such clarity and certainty that both parents stopped what they were doing to stare at her. She was standing at the window, one small hand pressed against the cold glass, looking out at the forest with an expression of such longing that it broke their hearts. But there was patience in her eyes, too, an understanding that seemed beyond her years, as if she knew that some things were worth waiting for, that the best friendships could survive any separation. As February arrived with its longer days and hints of warmth, they began to see signs of stirring in the forest. Birds returned, small animals became more active, and the snow began its slow retreat. Every morning, Ethan would check for tracks, for any sign that their friends were awakening. Jessica prepared for their return, stocking up on the foods they had learned the bears enjoyed, making sure everything was ready for when the morning visits resumed. Lily would stand at the window each morning, watching with patient eyes, never fussing or complaining, just waiting with a faith that humbled her parents. The first week of March brought unseasonably warm weather, melting much of the remaining snow and filling the air with the sound of running water from the mountain streams. It was on one of these warm mornings that Ethan saw it, movement at the tree line. His heart jumped as he called for Jessica and Lily, and together they watched as a familiar brown shape emerged from the forest. But something was different. Guardian had grown during the winter months, no longer the small cub they remembered, but a young bear approaching its full size. For a moment, they worried that the bond might have been broken, that the wild might have reclaimed their friend completely. But then, Guardian sat down in exactly the same spot it had always chosen, 20 feet from the porch, and made the same soft huffing sound they remembered so well. Lily, now walking confidently, toddled to the door and pressed both hands against it, calling out, "Bear! Bear!" with such joy that Guardian's ears perked up and it rose on its hind legs in their familiar greeting ritual. The bond hadn't been broken by the months of separation. If anything, it seemed stronger, as if the time apart had only confirmed how much they all meant to each other. Elder emerged from the forest more slowly, visibly older, moving with the careful dignity of age, but still present, still watching over them all. The morning routine resumed as if it had never been interrupted, though adjusted for Lily's new mobility and Guardian's increased size. The taste-testing ritual continued, though now it seemed more ceremonial than necessary, a tradition that connected them to the past and to the original Guardian who had started it all. Lily would toddle around the porch with Guardian, watching her every move, occasionally making sounds of warning if she got too close to the edge or reached for something potentially dangerous. It was like having the most unusual but devoted babysitter, one that just happened to be covered in fur and equipped with claws. Spring brought new discoveries and new rituals. Guardian began teaching Lily about the forest in its own way, bringing different plants and objects for her to examine, always carefully selected for safety. A smooth river stone would be followed the next day by a rough piece of bark, as if Guardian was teaching her about textures. Different flowers would appear in sequence, helping her learn colors and scents. Elder would sometimes contribute to these lessons, bringing things that seemed to have special significance, old objects that might have belonged to the previous family, creating a continuity between past and present that gave their strange relationship a sense of history and purpose. One particularly memorable morning in April, Guardian arrived with another bear, young like itself but slightly smaller. This new bear was nervous, hanging back at the forest edge, but Guardian was insistent, making encouraging sounds and repeatedly looking between the new bear and Lily. It took several days of patient coaxing, but eventually the new bear, whom they started calling Shy, joined the morning gatherings. It became clear that Guardian was teaching Shy, showing it that humans could be trusted, that this family was special, that this place was safe. They were witnessing the tradition being passed on, the knowledge being shared, ensuring that the bond would continue beyond just Guardian and Lily. As spring turned toward summer, with Lily now talking in short sentences and Guardian growing into its full strength, the relationship evolved again. Guardian began showing them deeper parts of the forest, leading them on careful expeditions to hidden meadows and secret streams. Always watchful, always protective, it would position itself between Lily and any potential danger, even if that danger was just a butterfly that startled the toddler. Elder would sometimes accompany these expeditions, moving slowly but deliberately, showing them things that Guardian might have missed, teaching them all about the forest's hidden language. The box of photographs they had found became a treasured family artifact, and Jessica often looked through them, seeing the parallels between their story and the one that had come before. She found herself wondering about Margaret, the baby in those old photos who had grown up with her own Guardian. Was she still alive? Did she remember? Did she know that the tradition had continued? Jessica wrote a letter to the address on some old mail they had found in the cabin's attic, not really expecting a response, but feeling compelled to reach out across time to this woman who would understand their experience in a way no one else could. The response came in June. A carefully handwritten letter from Margaret, now in her 70s and living in Seattle. She had never forgotten Guardian, she wrote, and not a day passed that she didn't think about the bear who had been her protector, playmate, and friend. She included more photographs, ones from her childhood that her parents hadn't put in the box, showing her at various ages with Guardian always nearby. In one, she was having a tea party with the bear sitting across from her, a tiny cup balanced comically in front of it. In another, she was reading a book while leaning against Guardian's warm bulk. The last photo showed her as a young woman, ready to leave for college, hugging Guardian goodbye. Margaret's letter explained things they had wondered about. The collar Elder wore had belonged to the original Guardian, a gift from her father who had wanted some way to identify their unusual friend if anyone else encountered him. The wooden bear toy had been hers, carved by her father and blessed, she said, by Guardian himself, who had carried it around for a full day before returning it to her. The taste-testing ritual had started when she was a baby, and Guardian had noticed her parents' nervousness about new foods. The bear had begun testing things first, showing them it was safe, though Margaret admitted she had no idea how a bear could have understood such a human concern. She ended her letter with a warning and a blessing. The warning was that not everyone would understand or accept what they had, that some people would try to interfere, to save them from the dangerous wild animals. They must be careful who they trusted with their secret. The blessing was that Lily was lucky beyond measure to have such a friend, that the bond between human and Guardian would shape her in ways they couldn't yet imagine, making her more empathetic, more connected to nature, more understanding of the mysteries that existed beyond human comprehension. She promised to visit if she could, to see for herself that the magic had continued, that the Guardians still watched over the cabin in the woods. Summer brought its own challenges and joys. Other bears began passing through the area, and Guardian and Elder had to establish that this territory was protected. There were a few tense moments when larger bears approached too close to the cabin, but Guardian, despite being younger and smaller, stood its ground with a fierceness that surprised everyone. It became clear that protecting Lily and her family wasn't just a choice for Guardian. It was a calling, a purpose that gave the young bear a strength beyond its years. Elder would back up Guardian during these confrontations, and together they created an impressive defense that kept any threats at bay. Lily's second birthday approached in July, and Jessica found herself planning a party that would include their unusual guests. She baked a special cake made with ingredients safe for bears, decorated with berries and honey. On the morning of Lily's birthday, Guardian arrived with Shy and Elder, but also with 2 more bears. Both young, both clearly nervous but curious. It seemed Guardian had been spreading the word, teaching others about the special family in the cabin. The birthday celebration was surreal but beautiful, with Lily surrounded by protectors, both human and Ursine, all united in their love for this special little girl. As they watched Lily share her birthday cake with Guardian, carefully placing small pieces where the bear could reach them, Ethan and Jessica marveled at how normal this had become for them. What had started as an impossible occurrence had become their daily reality, a reality where their daughter's best friend happened to be a bear, where their morning routine included a taste-testing ritual with a wild animal, where the forest itself seemed to have adopted them as its own. They no longer questioned why or how. They simply accepted and cherished this gift they had been given, this connection to something wild and wonderful that most people would never experience. The summer days were long and filled with adventure. Guardian had become an expert at finding the best swimming holes, leading them to places where the water was just the right depth for Lily to splash safely while the bears cooled off nearby. These expeditions felt like family outings, if one ignored the fact that half the family was covered in fur. Shy had overcome its initial nervousness, and now played with Lily almost as enthusiastically as Guardian, though always with a gentleness that belied its growing size and strength. Elder would find a sunny spot and doze, one eye always open, always watching. The eternal sentinel ensuring everyone's safety. Margaret's visit came in August, unannounced but somehow expected. Ethan saw the elderly woman walking up their drive, moving slowly but purposefully, and knew immediately who she was. Her eyes were already wet with tears before she reached the porch, and when Guardian emerged from the forest for the morning visit, she let out a sob that was part joy, part grief, part recognition. Guardian approached her with unusual directness, sniffing her carefully, and then did something extraordinary. It stood on its hind legs and placed its paws gently on her shoulders, looking into her eyes with an intensity that suggested recognition, not of her specifically, but of something about her, some essence that connected her to this place and this tradition. Margaret spent a week with them, sharing stories of her childhood with the original Guardian, filling in gaps in the history they had discovered. She showed them secret places in the forest that Guardian had shown her decades ago, and remarkably, their current Guardian knew these places too, leading them there before Margaret could finish giving directions. It was as if the knowledge had been passed down through generations of bears just as surely as Margaret's memories had been preserved through human years. She taught them songs she used to sing with Guardian, simple melodies that their Guardian seemed to recognize, humming along in its own bearish way. On her last morning, Margaret gave them a gift, a leather journal, worn and aged, filled with her father's observations about the original Guardian. It was a scientific treasure trove of behavioral notes, dietary preferences, seasonal patterns, but more than that, it was a love letter to the impossible bond they had all shared. The final entry, dated just days before Guardian's death, read simply, "He is fading, but not afraid." He knows his legacy will continue, the forest will remember, and someday another family will be blessed as we have been blessed. The guardians will return. As August turned to September, they could feel the cycle beginning again. Guardian and the other young bears were eating more, preparing for their second winter sleep. But this time, there was no sadness in the preparation. They had survived one separation and knew they could survive another. Lily understood now, too, in her 2-year-old way, that Bear would go night-night for the cold time, but would come back when the flowers returned. She helped prepare goodbye gifts, pictures she had colored with her chunky crayons, showing stick figures and bear shapes that Guardian examined with apparent seriousness before carefully carrying them away, presumably to wherever the bears made their winter den. The last visit before hibernation was both ceremonial and casual, a perfect encapsulation of how extraordinary had become ordinary in their lives. Guardian went through the now familiar ritual of touching important spots, but also spent time simply lying on the porch while Lily played around it, occasionally patting its thick fur or trying to share her toys. Elder watched with what could only be described as satisfaction, as if seeing that its work was done. The tradition successfully passed on, the bond secured for another generation. Shy and the other young bears had learned too, understanding that this place was special. These humans were family. This connection was to be protected and treasured. As the bears departed that final morning, Guardian turned back one last time and did something new. It stood on its hind legs and placed one paw over its heart, or where its heart would be, then extended that paw toward them. It was so human a gesture, so deliberate and meaningful that Jessica gasped and immediately returned it, placing her hand over her heart and then extending it toward Guardian. Lily imitated her mother, and even Ethan found himself making the gesture. Guardian nodded, satisfied, and then disappeared into the forest with the others, leaving the family with the absolute certainty that spring would bring them together again. Winter came again, but this time it felt less like a separation and more like a pause, a natural rhythm in the strange dance they were all part of. They had Margaret's journal and her father's notes to study, learning more about the history of the guardians and the families they had protected. They discovered that the phenomenon went back even further than they had thought, with hints in the journal about indigenous stories of spirit bears that protected certain families, suggestions that this bond between human and bear at this particular place might be ancient, predating any written record. Lily grew through the winter, her vocabulary expanding to include complex sentences about her bear friends. She would tell anyone who would listen about Guardian and Shy and Elder, though most people assumed these were imaginary friends or stuffed animals. Only a few trusted friends knew the truth, and even they struggled to believe it without seeing it for themselves. But Lily didn't care if others believed. She knew the truth, felt it in her heart every time she looked at the forest. Every time she saw the moon that Guardian had shown her how to howl at. Every time she touched the gifts the bears had brought that decorated her room like treasures from another world. The second spring reunion was even more joyous than the first. Guardian had grown again, now a fully mature bear, magnificent and powerful, but still gentle as a lamb with Lily. New cubs appeared with the returning bears, the next generation already being introduced to the magic of the cabin. Elder moved more slowly now, obviously ancient in bear years, but still present, still watching, still teaching. The cycle was continuing, expanding, creating a network of understanding between species that defied everything humans thought they knew about the natural world. 2 chapters of mentioned part has completed, but it was that summer when everything changed in a way none of them had anticipated. It started with small things, Guardian bringing unusual gifts, spending longer at each visit, seeming reluctant to leave even as the day grew hot. Elder, too, was behaving differently, often staying behind when the younger bears left, sitting at the forest edge and watching the cabin with those ancient eyes that held secrets they couldn't begin to fathom. Shy had taken on more responsibility, leading the newer cubs in their lessons while Guardian focused almost entirely on Lily, following her every movement with an intensity that was both protective and somehow sad. One morning in late July, Guardian arrived alone except for Elder, who moved so slowly that Ethan had to resist the urge to go help the old bear. They both settled on the porch, closer than they usually came, and Guardian did something unprecedented. It pushed open the screen door with its nose and entered the cabin for the first time. Lily was delighted, leading her friend on a tour of their home, showing it her room, her toys, the pictures she had drawn of their adventures together. Guardian examined everything with great seriousness, occasionally touching objects gently with its nose, as if memorizing them. Elder remained on the porch but watched through the open door, nodding occasionally as if approving of what it saw. That evening, after the bears had left, Jessica found something Guardian had left behind. Deliberately, she was certain. It was a small piece of fur, carefully bitten or pulled free, wrapped somehow in a large leaf. She understood immediately that it was a gift, a piece of Guardian to keep with them always. The gesture was so intentional, so clearly meaningful, that she felt a chill of premonition. Something was changing. Something important was about to happen, and Guardian was preparing them in the only way it knew how. The next morning brought the answer. Guardian arrived with not just Elder and Shy and the usual group, but with bears they had never seen before, adults who kept their distance but watched intently. Elder moved forward with surprising energy and authority, organizing the bears in what looked like a formal arrangement, a semicircle facing the cabin. Guardian took a position in the center, and then, in a moment that would be burned into their memories forever, it spoke. Not in words, of course, but in a series of vocalizations so deliberate, so patterned, that it was unmistakably language of some kind. The other bears responded in turn, creating a chorus that rose and fell like a song, or perhaps a ceremony. Lily seemed to understand what was happening even if her parents didn't. She walked out onto the porch, right up to Guardian, and wrapped her small arms around the bear's massive neck. Guardian lowered its great head, nuzzling the child gently, and made a sound that was unmistakably a goodbye. Not a "see you tomorrow" goodbye, but something more final. The bear was leaving, not for hibernation, but for something else. Some calling or responsibility that pulled it away from them. Elder approached then, and in the changing of positions, the passing of authority, it became clear that Elder would now be Lily's primary guardian, despite its advanced age, until another could be properly trained. The ceremony, for that's what it clearly was, continued for several more minutes. Each bear approached Lily in turn, touching noses with her or allowing her to pat them, acknowledging her as someone special, someone to be protected and cherished even in Guardian's absence. Shy specifically seemed to be accepting a new role, positioning itself as Guardian had once done, assuming the mantle of protector. When it was over, Guardian gave them each one last long look, made that heart gesture again, and then turned and walked into the forest with the unknown bears, not looking back, moving with purpose toward some destiny they couldn't understand. Elder stayed, as did Shy and the young cubs. The morning visits continued, but they were different now. Elder had taken on Guardian's role with a dignity that was almost regal, while Shy handled the more active duties of playing with and protecting Lily. They learned from Margaret's next letter that this was part of the pattern, that the original Guardian had also left suddenly one day, called away by something, and that another had taken its place. It was, she suggested, part of something larger. A network of guardians that extended far beyond their single cabin, protecting special places and special people for reasons that perhaps only the bears truly understood. As autumn approached once again, Elder's movements grew slower and more labored. The ancient bear would still make the journey from the forest to the cabin each morning, but it was clear that each trip cost more effort. Shai had fully assumed the role of Lily's active protector, but Elder remained the wisdom keeper, the one who knew all the secrets and traditions that needed to be passed on. One morning, Elder brought something extraordinary, an old collar, different from the one it wore, hidden somewhere in the forest for who knows how long. Inside the collar was a small metal tube, and inside that was a rolled piece of paper, aged and fragile but still readable. The paper contained a map, hand-drawn and annotated in multiple hands over what must have been many years. It showed the cabin and the surrounding forest, but also marked other locations, other cabins, other special places where, the notes suggested, similar bonds existed between humans and guardians. There were dates next to some locations, going back over 100 years, and names of both humans and bears. It was a record of a network, a web of connection between species that stretched across the entire mountain range and possibly beyond. Their cabin, their experience, was just one node in something much larger and more ancient than they had ever imagined. Elder seemed satisfied once they had found and understood the map. The old bear settled onto the porch with a deep sigh and closed its eyes, not in sleep but in something deeper. Shai positioned itself between Elder and any potential disturbance, standing guard over the Ancient One's rest. Lily seemed to understand that something important was happening. She sat quietly next to Elder, one small hand resting on the bear's thick fur, humming softly, the same tuneless song she had hummed as a baby when Guardian first appeared. The other bears emerged from the forest one by one, forming a circle around Elder, their heads bowed in what could only be described as reverence. Elder passed peacefully as the sun set that day, surrounded by both its bear family and its human one. There was no struggle, no pain, just a gentle fading like the last light leaving the sky. The bears stayed with the body through the night, taking turns standing vigil, and in the morning they carried Elder into the forest with a solemnity that was profoundly moving. Ethan and Jessica wanted to follow, to see where they would lay Elder to rest, but Shai gently but firmly blocked their path. This was bear business, sacred and private. But Lily was allowed to place a flower on Elder's still form before they took it away, a small gesture that the bears seemed to appreciate. 3 days later, Shai brought them Elder's collar, cleaned and somehow preserved. Inside the metal tube where the map had been, there was now a new addition, a small piece of paper with Lily's name written in Jessica's hand, formally adding her to the record of those protected by the Guardians. Shai wore the collar now, the new keeper of traditions, the new bridge between worlds. And life continued, different but unbroken, the bond evolving but never weakening. Guardian was gone. Elder had passed on, but the connection remained, carried forward by Shai and the cubs who were learning what it meant to be guardians. As winter approached once more, they prepared for the separation with the confidence of experience. Shai had proven itself a worthy successor to Guardian, just as protective, just as gentle, just as mysteriously intelligent. The younger bears were learning, each developing their own relationship with Lily, who at nearly 3 years old now accepted her unusual friends as simply part of life. She would miss them during the winter, but she understood the rhythm now, the cycle of presence and absence that marked their strange and wonderful relationship. On the last morning before hibernation, something unexpected happened. Guardian returned. Older, larger, with new scars that suggested adventures and battles in distant places, but unmistakably their guardian. The reunion was joyous but brief. Guardian had come to check on them, to see that Lily was well and protected, to acknowledge Shy's new role with what seemed like approval. The two bears touched noses in a gesture of respect and understanding, and then Guardian gave them each that familiar heart gesture before disappearing back into the forest. It was a reminder that even when separated, the bonds they had formed were unbreakable, stretching across distance and time, connecting them in ways that went beyond physical presence. That winter, Jessica gave birth to a son, Logan. As she held him for the first time, she wondered if he too would have a guardian, if the tradition would extend to him as it had to Lily. She got her answer in the spring when Shy returned with a young cub, barely old enough to be away from its mother, who seemed immediately fascinated by the new baby. The cub would sit for hours watching Logan sleep, making soft, soothing sounds when he cried, already beginning the taste-testing ritual even though Logan was still months away from solid food. The tradition was not only continuing but expanding, adapting to include new members of both families. Margaret visited again that summer, bringing with her a historian who specialized in indigenous folklore. Together, they pieced together a larger story from fragments of legend and scattered historical records. The Guardians, it seemed, were part of an ancient compact between the first peoples of these mountains and the bears who lived here. Certain families were chosen, though the criteria for selection remained mysterious, to be protected and to protect in return. The cabin stood on what had once been sacred ground, a meeting place between worlds, and the Guardians were honoring an agreement that predated written history. The historian showed them photographs from other locations marked on Elder's map. Other families with their own guardians, some going back generations. There were patterns in the stories, similar rituals, similar bonds, similar mysterious intelligence in the bears involved. But there were also unique elements to each relationship, as if the Guardians adapted to the specific needs of each family they protected. Some Guardians were teachers, others were purely protectors, and some, like theirs, were friends and family members in every way that mattered. As Lily grew, her understanding of her unique situation deepened. She began to draw more sophisticated pictures of her adventures with the bears, creating a visual record that complemented Jessica's written journal. She invented games that the bears could play, taught them simple tricks, and even began to understand some of their vocalizations, responding appropriately to different sounds. Watching her interact with Shy and the other bears was like watching someone speak a language that existed nowhere else. A perfect understanding between species that should have been impossible, but was undeniably real. Logan's relationship with his guardian cub, whom they called Little One, developed differently, but was no less profound. While Lily and her guardians had always maintained a certain respectful distance, Logan and Little One were physically affectionate from the start. The cub would curl up next to Logan's crib during morning visits, and as Logan began to crawl, the two would tumble around together like litter mates. It was a different expression of the same bond, adapted to the personalities involved, showing that the guardian relationship was not rigid but fluid, shaped by the individuals involved. The seasons turned, years passed, and the extraordinary became routine. Other families began to visit, those from the other locations on Elder's map, creating a network of people who understood the impossible reality of the Guardians. They shared stories, compared notes, and marveled together at the mystery they were all part of. Some had been living with Guardians for generations, others were newly chosen, but all shared the same sense of wonder and responsibility. They were keepers of a secret that the world wasn't ready to understand, protectors of a magic that still existed in hidden places. One summer, when Lily was 6 and Logan was 3, Guardian returned again, this time to stay. Older, calmer, carrying the wisdom of its travels. It resumed its place in their lives as naturally as if it had never left. It worked alongside Shy now. 2 protectors instead of 1, each with their own strengths and roles. Guardian had stories to tell in its own way, showing them through gifts and gestures the places it had been, the things it had seen. It had been spreading the tradition, they realized, teaching other bears in other places about the compact, ensuring that the Guardian bond would continue to spread and strengthen. The taste-testing ritual evolved as the children grew older, becoming more symbolic than practical but no less important. It was a daily renewal of trust, a reminder of how their relationship had begun and why it mattered. Every morning, as the sun painted the mountains gold and the mist rose from the forest floor, they would gather on the porch, humans and bears together, sharing food and companionship in a ritual that connected them to generations past and future. The bears would still carefully sample whatever was offered. The children would still wait for the approving huff that meant it was safe, and life would continue in its beautiful, impossible rhythm. As Lily approached her 10th birthday, she began to take on more responsibility in maintaining the Guardian relationship. She learned to read the bears' moods and needs, to recognize when they were warning of danger or simply wanting to play. She became a teacher to younger children who were just discovering their own guardians, sharing the wisdom that had been passed down to her. She understood now that she was part of something larger than herself, a tradition that she would one day pass on to her own children, continuing the chain that stretched back into prehistory and forward into an unknowable future. Logan, too, grew into his role, developing an almost mystical connection with Little One that went beyond what even Lily had with her guardians. The two seemed to share thoughts, moving in synchronization, understanding each other at a level that transcended normal communication. It was as if the Guardian bond was evolving, growing stronger with each generation, adapting to a world that desperately needed reminders that magic and mystery still existed. The connections between species were not only possible but essential. The cabin in the mountains became a pilgrimage site of sorts for those who knew about the Guardians. Families would come to learn, to share their own stories, to find comfort in knowing they weren't alone in their extraordinary experience. Jessica and Ethan became unofficial historians and teachers, maintaining the records, preserving the stories, ensuring that the knowledge wouldn't be lost. They expanded the cabin, adding rooms for visitors, creating a sanctuary where the impossible was normal and the magical was everyday reality. But they were always careful to protect the secret from those who wouldn't understand. The world outside their mountain remained skeptical, dangerous to the delicate balance they maintained. They had heard stories of other Guardian relationships that had been discovered and destroyed by well-meaning wildlife officials or frightened neighbors. So they kept their truth close, shared only with those who had proven themselves worthy of the knowledge, those who understood that some things were too precious to expose to the harsh light of public scrutiny. As the story spread quietly through the network of Guardian families, patterns began to emerge. The children who grew up with Guardians were different, marked somehow by the experience. They were more empathetic, more connected to nature, more aware of the subtle currents that ran beneath the surface of everyday life. They grew up to be protectors themselves, not just of bears but of wild places and wild things everywhere. They became scientists and conservationists, writers and artists, teachers and healers, all carrying within them the knowledge that the impossible was possible, that love could transcend species, that ancient compacts still held power in the modern world. Lily wrote her first book about the Guardians when she was 16. disguising it as fiction but pouring all the truth she knew into its pages. It became a quiet bestseller, found by those who needed to find it, recognized as truth by those who had eyes to see. She received letters from around the world, some dismissing her story as fantasy, but others recognizing something real in her words, asking in carefully coded language if such things were really possible. She always responded the same way, neither confirming nor denying, but suggesting that magic existed for those who were chosen to see it. Logan became a wildlife biologist, studying bear behavior with an insight that amazed his professors, but which he could never fully explain. His published papers revolutionized understanding of ursine intelligence and social structures, though he always had to leave out the most extraordinary observations, the things that science wasn't ready to accept. Little One, now fully grown and magnificent, would sometimes accompany him on his research trips, two experts in their field working together in a partnership that would have been unbelievable if anyone had known about it. The Guardians themselves seemed to understand that their role was evolving. As the world changed around them, becoming more dangerous for wild things, they adapted their protection to meet new threats. They guided their human families away from areas where development threatened, warned of environmental dangers before human instruments could detect them, and sometimes even intervened directly to prevent catastrophes that would have destroyed their shared habitat. They were no longer just protectors of individual families, but guardians of the intersection between the human and wild worlds. When Lily had her own daughter, Emma, the Guardians were waiting. A young cub, descended from Shai's line, appeared on the morning of Emma's first breakfast, beginning the ritual anew. Watching her daughter go through the same wonder she had experienced, Lily understood fully the cyclical nature of their bond. Each generation renewed the compact, strengthened the connection, and added their own chapter to the ongoing story. The taste-testing ritual continued, as meaningful for Emma as it had been for Lily, as it had been for Margaret, as it had been for unnamed children stretching back through time. The climate began to change more dramatically, bringing new challenges to both human and bear families. The Guardians' knowledge became even more crucial, their understanding of the forest's rhythms helping their human companions adapt to the changing world. They showed them which plants would survive the new weather patterns, where water would remain reliable, how to live in harmony with a world in flux. The ancient wisdom that had seemed quaint became essential survival knowledge, and the Guardian families found themselves at the forefront of teaching others how to live sustainably. Guardian, ancient now by bear standards, still visited regularly, though it moved slowly and spent most of its time resting on the porch, watching the younger generations play. It had become a living legend, known throughout the network of Guardian families as the one who had traveled, who had spread the knowledge, who had ensured the tradition would survive. Young bears would come just to sit near it, to learn through proximity to such a legendary figure, and Guardian, patient and wise, would share its knowledge in the quiet way of bears, through gesture and example, rather than words. One autumn morning, Guardian performed a new ritual. It gathered all the bears and all the humans together, and led them deep into the forest to a grove none of them had seen before. There, in a circle of ancient pines, were monuments of a sort. Carefully arranged stones and carved trees that told the story of the Guardians going back generations. Guardian showed them how to add their own marks to the record, ensuring their chapter would be remembered. It was a sacred place, a library written in stone and wood, preserving the history of an impossible bond that had shaped so many lives. As Emma grew, she showed an even deeper connection to the Guardians than her mother or uncle had possessed. She seemed to actually understand their language, responding to complex vocalizations with appropriate actions or emotions. The bears treated her with a reverence that went beyond even their usual protectiveness, as if recognizing in her something special, perhaps the culmination of generations of growing connection. She would spend hours in silent communion with her guardian, the two of them sitting together in perfect peace, sharing something that existed beyond human understanding. The world outside continued to encroach on their mountain sanctuary, but the guardian families had learned to adapt. They purchased land when they could, created conservation easements, used every legal tool available to protect their sacred spaces. The bears helped by making themselves scarce when strangers came near, maintaining the secret through careful absence. It was a delicate dance, preserving the magic while engaging with a world that increasingly left no room for mystery. Logan married another child of guardians, someone who understood the bond and brought her own guardian relationship to their union. Their children grew up with multiple protectors, a whole clan of bears who treated the human children as their own cubs. The interconnections grew more complex with each generation, creating a web of relationships that strengthened both communities. Bear cubs and human children grew up together, learning from each other, creating a hybrid culture that belonged fully to neither species but was precious to both. The taste-testing ritual remained at the heart of it all, performed every morning without fail, a constant in a changing world. Even when the children grew up and moved away for college or careers, they would return for the ritual whenever possible, maintaining their connection to the tradition. And when they had children of their own, they would bring them back to the mountain to be introduced to their guardians, to begin their own journey into the impossible, to take their place in the ancient compact. Scientists began to notice the unusual health and longevity of the bear populations in certain mountain regions, the same regions where guardian families lived. They couldn't explain why these bears seemed more intelligent, more adaptable, more resilient than their counterparts elsewhere. Studies were conducted, papers were published, but the real secret remained hidden. The guardian bears were evolving, shaped by their interaction with humans just as the humans were shaped by their connection to the bears. It was a co-evolution, a mutual lifting up that benefited both species. Emma became a storyteller like her mother, but her medium was film. She created documentaries about wildlife that seemed to capture impossible moments of animal behavior, scenes that other filmmakers tried for years to replicate without success. Only the guardian families knew her secret, that her subjects were not random wild animals but friends and family who trusted her enough to reveal their true selves to her camera. Her films changed how people thought about wildlife, planting seeds of wonder and respect that would grow into greater protection for wild places. As Guardian's time grew short, it began a final teaching, showing them all how to face ending with grace. It would still perform the morning ritual, still taste-test food for the newest babies, but everyone could see it was preparing for a final journey. Other elderly bears began visiting, contemporaries of Guardian who had established their own guardian relationships elsewhere. They would sit together in the sun, these ancient protectors, sharing silent memories of a lifetime spent bridging worlds. When Guardian finally passed, it was surrounded by 3 generations of the human family it had protected and dozens of bears it had taught and influenced. The mourning was profound, but also celebratory, recognizing a life beautifully lived, a purpose fully realized. They buried Guardian next to Elder, in the grove of monuments, adding a special marker that told its story in symbols that both bears and humans could understand. The tradition would continue, had already continued, but Guardian's chapter was complete, and it was a magnificent chapter indeed. Young bears continued to arrive, drawn by something they couldn't name but couldn't resist. Each one was tested by the established guardians, taught the rituals and responsibilities, and either accepted into the tradition or gently sent away to find their own path. Not every bear could be a guardian, just as not every human family was chosen for the bond. It required something special on both sides. A capacity for trust and love that transcended species boundaries. A willingness to accept the impossible as everyday reality. The taste testing ritual evolved with each generation but never disappeared. Even when the children grew up eating manufactured baby food that couldn't possibly be harmful, the bears would still perform their ancient duty, maintaining the tradition that had started it all. It had become more than just ensuring food safety, it was a daily renewal of vows, a reminder of mutual care and protection, a physical manifestation of love that needed no words to be understood. As the years turned to decades and the decades accumulated into a century, since the first recorded guardian bond at the cabin, the tradition had spread far beyond what anyone could have imagined. Guardian families existed on every continent where bears lived, each with their own version of the ritual, their own stories of impossible connection. They remained hidden, protecting their secret from a world that wasn't ready to understand, but they also remained connected, a global network of humans and bears working together to preserve something precious and irreplaceable. Emma's daughter, Rose, showed signs of being the strongest guardian-bonded human yet. Even as an infant, she seemed to communicate with the bears through pure emotion and intention. Her guardian, a descendant of Little One, responded to her thoughts before she could express them, anticipating her needs with an accuracy that astounded even the experienced guardian families. Watching them together was like watching the future of the bond, evolved to a level of connection that suggested even greater possibilities ahead. The morning ritual continued, would always continue, as long as there were bears and humans willing to trust each other with their hearts. Every sunrise brought them together on the porch. Every breakfast renewed their ancient compact. Every taste test reaffirmed that some things transcended logic and lived purely in the realm of love. The bears would arrive with their gifts from the forest. The humans would offer their food to be tested, and life would go on in its beautiful, impossible way. As the story spread through quiet whispers and carefully coded messages, more families discovered they had been chosen. Some had been living with guardians for years without understanding what was happening, dismissing the unusual bear behavior as coincidence or imagination. But when they learned the truth, when they understood the tradition they had been brought into, they embraced it with the same wonder and dedication as all who had come before. The network grew stronger, the bonds multiplied, and the ancient compact adapted to meet the challenges of a new world. The taste-testing ritual became a symbol of something larger, a reminder that trust could be built slowly and maintained faithfully, that different species could find common ground in caring for the vulnerable, that love was a universal language that required no words. Every morning, as bears and humans gathered to share food and companionship, they were writing another page in a story that had no ending, only continuous renewal, endless evolution, and boundless possibility for connection across the boundaries that seemed to separate but ultimately could not divide those who chose to see with their hearts. The guardians had taught them that the impossible was simply the possible waiting to be recognized, that magic existed in the patient building of trust, that the wild and the domestic could meet in sacred space and create something entirely new. The taste-testing ritual would continue tomorrow, and tomorrow and tomorrow, each morning bringing its own small miracle of connection. Each breakfast a renewal of the promise made long ago when the first guardian decided that these particular humans were worth protecting, worth knowing, worth loving with the fierce and gentle devotion that only a bear could offer.